Humanity did not immediately understand what had happened. It only felt it. When the first nuclear weapons were used, the world crossed a boundary it could not see, but would never escape. The explosions ended a war, but they also introduced a new idea into human history, that civilization itself could be erased in a single decision. From that moment on, fear was no longer local, temporary, or theoretical. It became global and permanent. What made this fear different was not the scale of destruction alone, but its certainty. Previous weapons required time, manpower, and prolonged effort. Nuclear weapons required a moment, one order, one sequence of actions. The distance between intention and annihilation collapsed. For the first time, humanity understood that its survival depended not on endurance, but on restraint. This realization did not spread through panic. It spread through silence. Governments reacted cautiously. Military planners rewrote doctrines quietly. Scientists who had built the weapon struggled to comprehend its implications. The bomb was no longer just a tool of war. It was a mirror, reflecting the limits of human control over its own creations. The fear that followed was not irrational. It was measured, calculated, integrated into policy and planning. Nations began to organize themselves around the possibility of total destruction, not because they expected it, but because they could no longer rule it out. The future now included an ending that could arrive without warning. For ordinary people, this change was subtle at first. Life continued. Cities were rebuilt. Families planned futures. But beneath daily routine lay a new awareness, that safety was conditional, that peace existed only as long as restraint held, that the margin for error had vanished. This was the birth of nuclear fear, not as hysteria, but as knowledge. Knowledge that could not be unlearned. The world had survived the war, but it had learned something far more unsettling than how to fight. It had learned how easily it could end. And once that knowledge entered the global consciousness, there was no way to contain it. As this knowledge settled in, the world began to reorganize itself around a single, uncomfortable fact. Absolute destruction was now possible, but not inevitable. Survival would depend on discipline, communication, and an unprecedented level of self-control. The nuclear age did not demand bravery. It demanded restraint. Governments responded first, but cautiously. Public reactions were managed. Information was filtered. The goal was not to alarm populations, but to stabilize them. Panic was considered as dangerous as the weapon itself. Fear had to be contained, structured, and controlled, just like the forces that had created it. Military doctrine changed fundamentally. Victory was no longer measured by conquest but by prevention. The purpose of nuclear weapons became paradoxical. They existed to ensure they would never be used again. Deterrence replaced engagement. Threat replaced action. Power was demonstrated through readiness rather than aggression. This shift placed immense pressure on decision-makers. For the first time in history, leaders were forced to consider consequences that extended beyond defeat. A single miscalculation could erase not just armies or cities, but the continuity of civilization itself. The margin for error disappeared. Precision in judgment became as important as strength. This created a constant state of vigilance. Nuclear fear did not manifest as daily terror, but as background tension. It shaped policy, research, and diplomacy quietly. Resources were poured into stability rather than victory. Arms control emerged not as idealism, but as necessity. Limits were negotiated because unlimited power was unusable. For scientists and engineers, the fear was deeply personal. Many had built the weapon believing it would end the war and save lives. Now they confronted a future in which their creation threatened everything they sought to protect. The nuclear age forced a reckoning between knowledge and responsibility that had no historical precedent. This reckoning extended into culture and education. The bomb became a symbol not of triumph, but of vulnerability. It appeared in art, literature, and public discourse as a reminder that progress carried consequences beyond intention. Humanity had mastered energy at a scale it could barely control. What made nuclear fear enduring was its invisibility. Unlike previous threats, it did not require action to remain present. The weapons could remain unused, hidden, and silent, yet their existence alone reshaped behavior. Peace was no longer the absence of war. It was the successful management of catastrophic potential. The world had entered an era where survival depended not on fighting better wars, but on avoiding them entirely. And that requirement changed everything. As nuclear fear became embedded into global consciousness, it reshaped how time itself was understood. The future was no longer imagined as a distant horizon of progress, but as something fragile, dependent on uninterrupted restraint. Long-term planning began to include scenarios of sudden, irreversible loss. History, for the first time, had an imaginable endpoint. This awareness altered diplomacy profoundly. Conversations between rivals were no longer guided solely by interest or ideology, but by survival. Communication channels were preserved even at moments of intense hostility. Silence became dangerous. Misinterpretation became lethal. The ability to signal intent clearly without appearing weak became one of the most delicate skills in international relations. Crises during this era revealed the true weight of nuclear fear. Moments of escalation were experienced not as steps toward war, but as approaches toward an edge no one could afford to cross. Each confrontation carried the same question beneath it, not who would win, but whether anyone would remain. The absence of war was no longer accidental. It was actively maintained. For ordinary citizens, this translated into a quiet contradiction. Life improved materially in many places, yet anxiety remained unresolved. The bomb did not dominate daily thought, but it shaped the boundaries of optimism. Progress was celebrated cautiously. Innovation was admired and feared simultaneously. The promise of technology was forever paired with the memory of its destructive potential. Governments adapted by institutionalizing caution. Layers of review, authorization, and redundancy were introduced to slow decision-making deliberately. Speed had once been an advantage. Now it was a risk. The nuclear age valued delay, verification, and restraint over decisive action. Systems were designed to prevent any single individual from acting alone. This emphasis on control did not eliminate danger. It redistributed it. The greatest threat became not aggression, but error. Mechanical failure, miscommunication, or false warning could trigger consequences no intention could undo. As a result, trust shifted from individuals to processes, from instinct to procedure. The psychological burden of this environment was significant. Knowing that catastrophe could occur without warning required constant compartmentalization. Societies learned to function normally while carrying an abstract but absolute threat in the background. Fear was neither confronted nor ignored. It was managed. This management shaped the moral landscape of the era. Questions of responsibility expanded beyond action to include restraint. Success was defined by what did not happen. The absence of disaster became the highest achievement. History recorded victories that were invisible and failures that never occurred. Nuclear fear, therefore, did not paralyze humanity. It disciplined it. It imposed limits on ambition and forced a reckoning with consequence. The world learned that power without control was indistinguishable from catastrophe, and in learning that lesson, it entered a new phase of existence, one where survival depended not on strength alone, but on the ability to live with the knowledge of its own potential destruction. As this disciplined restraint became routine, nuclear fear began to shape not only decisions but identities. Nations defined themselves by how responsibly they handled destructive power. Legitimacy was tied to control. Status was measured by credibility rather than aggression. Possessing nuclear capability was no longer enough. What mattered was convincing others that it would never be used recklessly. This requirement transformed military planning. Forces existed in a permanent state of readiness without expectation of deployment. Exercises were conducted not to practice attack, but to ensure command stability under stress. The emphasis shifted from winning wars to preventing loss of control. The greatest failure was not defeat, but escalation. Arms accumulation followed the same logic. Paradoxically, more weapons were built to ensure they would never be fired. Deterrence relied on balance, and balance demanded symmetry. Any perceived advantage threatened stability. As a result, rivalry produced accumulation without intention, growth without use. The nuclear arsenal became less a tool than a condition. This condition extended into domestic life in subtle ways. Education emphasized scientific literacy and civic responsibility. Culture reflected anxiety through restraint rather than panic. Films, literature, and art explored themes of fragility, consequence, and unintended outcomes. The bomb lingered as an idea more than an object. Political leadership operated under constant psychological strain. Decisions were made knowing that misjudgment could end history. This awareness did not produce recklessness. It produced caution so extreme that inaction was often preferred to risk. Delay became a strategy. Ambiguity became protection. Yet this caution carried its own costs. Innovation slowed in areas where disruption threatened balance. Moral clarity blurred as survival eclipsed principle. Actions were justified not because they were right, but because they preserved stability. The nuclear age forced uncomfortable compromises between ethics and endurance. International trust remained fragile. Cooperation existed, but it was conditional. Agreements were monitored relentlessly. Verification mattered as much as signature. Confidence was built not on promises, but on evidence. Transparency became a strategic tool rather than a moral choice. This environment rewarded patience above all else. Time became the ultimate test of credibility. To endure without catastrophe was to succeed. Each year without escalation reinforced belief in the system, even as it deepened dependence on it. The longer the nuclear peace lasted, the harder it became to imagine any alternative. By this stage, nuclear fear was no longer acute. It was ambient. It shaped the air rather than the alarm. People lived with it not because they accepted it, but because they had no other option. The knowledge could not be removed, only normalized. This normalization marked a turning point. Humanity had not eliminated the danger it created. It had learned to coexist with it, and that coexistence would define global life for decades to come. As this coexistence with nuclear fear deepened, a subtle but powerful shift occurred in how humanity understood responsibility. For the first time, survival was no longer guaranteed by strength, numbers, or victory. It depended on collective restraint across borders, ideologies, and generations. The fate of millions rested on decisions made by a few, and on systems designed to slow those decisions down. This reality reshaped ethics at the highest level. Moral questions were no longer limited to action. Inaction carried equal weight. Choosing not to escalate became as consequential as choosing to strike. Leaders were judged not only by what they did, but by what they deliberately avoided doing. History began to value caution in ways it never had before. The nuclear age also altered the meaning of error. Mistakes had always been part of human affairs, but now they carried absolute consequences. A single misinterpretation could erase everything that followed it. As a result, humility became a strategic necessity. No system could rely on perfection. It had to assume failure and build barriers against it. This assumption produced layers of redundancy, verification, and delay. Commands required confirmation. Warnings demanded cross-checking. Authority was fragmented intentionally to prevent unilateral action. These mechanisms were not signs of weakness. They were acknowledgments of human limitation in the presence of overwhelming power. Public awareness of this reality remained partial. Governments rarely spoke openly about near misses or miscalculations. Stability depended on confidence, and too much transparency risked eroding it. Nuclear fear was managed carefully, shared selectively, and framed as a distant possibility rather than an immediate danger. The goal was not ignorance, but calm. Yet beneath this calm, the awareness persisted. Generations grew up knowing that peace was conditional, that safety relied on restraint maintained every day, not on a final victory. This knowledge shaped political culture, civic expectations, and global cooperation. The nuclear age demanded maturity on a scale humanity had never practiced before. At the same time, the fear reshaped priorities. Resources flowed into prevention rather than expansion. Diplomacy became continuous rather than episodic. Communication channels were preserved even between enemies, because silence had become dangerous. Talking was safer than misunderstanding. This environment produced a paradoxical form of stability. The very weapons capable of ending civilization also enforced caution powerful enough to prevent their use. Fear became a regulator, not a moral one, but a practical one. The bomb did not make humanity wiser. It made recklessness unacceptable. This is why nuclear fear cannot be dismissed as hysteria or overreaction. It was a rational response to a reality without precedent. Humanity had crossed a threshold where survival depended on its ability to restrain itself indefinitely. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no return to innocence. Only the long work of living responsibly with power that could never be uninvented. As the decades progressed, nuclear fear settled into the background of global life, shaping decisions even when it was not openly acknowledged. It influenced budgets, alliances, education, and technological priorities. Entire generations grew up under its shadow without ever experiencing a nuclear war, yet their world was organized to prevent one at all costs. The absence of catastrophe became proof of success. This long period without use reinforced a dangerous illusion that nuclear weapons had somehow become safe. In reality, nothing fundamental had changed. The same destructive potential remained, locked behind systems that required constant maintenance, vigilance, and discipline. Stability depended not on the weapons themselves but on the people and institutions managing them, and those were always imperfect. Near misses revealed this fragility. Technical failures, misread data, and human error repeatedly brought the world closer to disaster than most people ever knew. Each avoided catastrophe strengthened belief in the system, but it also highlighted how thin the margin truly was. Survival often hinged on hesitation, skepticism, or a single decision to pause. These moments underscored a central truth of the nuclear age. Restraint mattered more than doctrine. Protocols existed, but individuals still interpreted them. Machines processed information, but humans judged meaning. The final barrier between warning and annihilation was always a person capable of doubt. This reality placed enormous moral weight on those within the system. Responsibility was concentrated in positions that rarely received public attention. The most consequential actions were invisible, decisions not to escalate, not to assume intent, not to act too quickly. History's narrow escapes were written in silence. Over time, this pattern reshaped how humanity evaluated leadership. The ideal leader of the nuclear age was not the most decisive, but the most controlled. Strength was associated with patience. Authority was measured by the ability to absorb pressure without reacting impulsively. These traits ran counter to traditional images of power, yet they proved essential for survival. The persistence of nuclear fear also altered how future risks were perceived. Humanity learned that technological advancement could outpace ethical readiness. The lesson extended beyond weapons. New technologies were increasingly evaluated not only for benefit, but for catastrophic potential. The nuclear age introduced a permanent awareness of unintended consequences. This awareness did not produce optimism. It produced caution. Progress continued, but under scrutiny. The question was no longer what could be built, but what should be built, and how its risks could be managed before they manifested. Nuclear fear became a template for confronting other existential threats. In this sense, the bomb changed more than warfare. It changed the human relationship with power itself. Knowledge was no longer neutral. Capability was no longer inherently positive. Every advance carried the burden of responsibility. The nuclear age taught humanity a lesson it could not afford to forget, that survival in a world of overwhelming power depends less on what can be done and more on what must never be done. When the world looks back on the nuclear age, it often focuses on what did not happen. No global nuclear war, no final exchange, no collapse of civilization. This absence is sometimes mistaken for proof that the danger was exaggerated. In reality, it is proof of how narrowly catastrophe was avoided. Nuclear fear did not protect humanity by eliminating risk. It protected humanity by forcing restraint to become a permanent discipline. The world survived not because it became safer, but because it learned to live inside its own limits. Survival depended on countless decisions made quietly, often by individuals who chose hesitation over certainty. This is the uncomfortable truth of the nuclear age. Peace was not achieved through trust or harmony. It was maintained through awareness of consequences too severe to ignore. The fear was rational, it was earned, and it never truly disappeared. Even today, the logic introduced by nuclear weapons continues to shape global behavior. Power is still measured by restraint. Security is still defined by stability rather than victory. Catastrophe remains possible but unacceptable. Humanity lives not beyond the nuclear age but within the framework it created. The most profound legacy of nuclear fear is not technological. It is psychological. Humanity learned that it could end itself, and that knowledge changed everything. It imposed humility where arrogance once thrived. It replaced certainty with caution. It forced a reckoning between capability and responsibility that has no expiration date. The nuclear age did not make humanity wiser by choice. It made wisdom a requirement for survival, and that requirement remains in place as long as the weapons exist. This is why nuclear fear is not a chapter in history. It is a condition of the modern world, one that demands discipline, patience, and an acceptance of limits that previous generations never had to consider. The bomb did not end war, it ended innocence, and once innocence is lost, it can never be recovered, only managed.